Welcome to FinOps Camp Episode 2. I'm Clinton Ford, Director of Product Marketing at Unravel Data, and I'm joined by our guests, Sanjeev Mohan, Principal and Founder at SanjMo, and Chris Santiago, VP of Solutions Engineering at Unravel Data. Thank you for joining us today.
So great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Quinn. Likewise.
So here's a look at today's agenda. We'll begin with 5 FinOps tips, a fireside chat with Sanjeev and Chris, and then following the fireside chat, and then have some time to discuss the top questions that you enter in the Q&A window. All right, so now it's my pleasure to welcome our guests to this fireside chat. Thank you so much. Appreciate having you both here, Sanjeev and Chris.
Clinton, FinOps is literally on top of everyone's mind. Now, you would think that right now, everyone's talking about generative AI. Very true. But even then, the question of FinOps comes up. As a case in point was AWS Summit in New York City, and the keynote by Swami there was about generative AI and all the new things, Amazon Bedrock and all of these new introductions. But a key piece in that announcement was that if you use our new hardware, so they've got 2 chips, Trainium and Inferentia 2, then you will reduce your training cost by 40%. So you can see that although everyone is enamored and talks about generative AI and these new foundation models, but doing it cost effectively is job numero uno. What do you think, Chris? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think LLMs, Gen AI, very popular topic right now. I think, dare I use the word bandwagon right now, but I mean, it is, very powerful. I think something that the public is now really starting to see the benefits that AI can bring in, and what a powerful platform. I think that, a lot of folks are going to be starting their journey here by thinking, hey, we've got our own data we've been collecting with our customers. Let's actually go ahead and train throw some LLM at it and, provide some sort of maybe some new data product to the masses where it can be powered by the data we've been capturing from customers. You've got the likes of AWS with their Bedrock Foundation, having these LLM specific infrastructure hardware, which is going to be great, but it still doesn't cover the fact that in order for you to have a very powerful LLM or just AI model just in general, that's going to require lots of data volumes. That's also going to, we need to make sure that we're capturing accurate data. So there's going to be some data quality that's in there as well. But last but not least, you're going to need the talent to get all the pipelines working and getting all this information to the models, so that way everything is effective. I think that we are early on the stage or on the journey for folks to really harness the power of LLMs. But I do think that as folks go down this journey, I think we're going to start hearing in the news the horror or the nightmare stories of folks where, hey, I just spent $500,000 or $1 million plus or even more, multi-million trying to get my LLMs to work, and I'm still not there. So very powerful tech, but I think that companies that are starting this journey need to consider that you need to have the proper plumbing in place, whether that's data quality, the right data volumes, and talent to make this effective.
Thank you, Chris. So I came across this blog post recently, Sanjeev, by Lydia from Gartner, and she was talking about how FinOps can be a big waste of money. I was wondering if you've seen that blog post, if you have any reaction to some of the points that she raises.
So first of all, Lydia Leong was my colleague at Gartner, and she is absolutely one of the top Gartner analysts when it comes to cloud. But she covers infrastructure. We talk about data, and I think there's a distinct difference between infrastructure observability, infrastructure cost management, and data. Data just tends to change very rapidly. It's changing all the time. And so although she says, FinOps can be a big waste of time, I don't want to talk about the infrastructure pieces, because some of the things that she says is that if you have predictable workloads, your infrastructure is static, and you don't have very high infrastructure needs, then why would you put a FinOps team in place? The problem with data is that A, it can change, as I just said. B, the data providers or the software companies are constantly bringing in new enhancements. So maybe there was a way for me to run a SQL command in the cloud on a cloud data warehouse and incur some cost. But guess what? Last week, this provider introduced a new partitioning technique. Now I don't have to do a full table scan. I can just look up a partition. So if I don't have FinOps and I don't have this discipline, then I'm paying the same price I was paying earlier. Also, my workloads may change. I may go from doing batch to mini batches to streaming. So the point is that your infrastructure may be stable, but your data architecture is in flux. And it depends upon the volume of data, the usage of data, the types of data. The world we are moving into is where we are consistently looking at the data that's coming in, inferring its quality, inferring its header, metadata, and then we are orchestrating it depending upon the context. So in this scenario, I don't want to be locked into a situation where I say, well, because yesterday I did not need FinOps, so tomorrow I won't need, because tomorrow I may change the way I do things. So that's why I feel having data FinOps be a good discipline in your architecture is extremely important.
Yeah, I mean, I think she makes some good points in there when she's talking about self-service. Maybe folks don't have direct access to, cause issues by asking for too many resources, and depending on the workloads, variability, infrastructure. I mean, she has some good points there, but there are certain dimensions that weren't covered, right? I think just the maturity of the customer in their data journey to begin with, right? Maybe right now they have a few workloads in AWS or Azure, pick your cloud from that standpoint, and maybe cost isn't much of a concern, right? So, unleashing their developers to do whatever they want, maybe some bad practices, and as the customer gets more value from their data products in the cloud, then it's a big problem, right? Because there's been some inefficiencies rampant, and there weren't the best, or the protocols of a FinOps practice weren't in place, and now it's a massive cleanup and you're starting from scratch, right? So I think that's a lot of times it's always good to have the right guardrails in place, the right visibility to, maybe it's a small build today, but organizations are surprised, right? Where, within the next few months now, their cloud bill is, triple, 4 times, 5 times the cost than where they thought they were, right? Because data volumes are growing, it's going to ask for more compute resources. They've got more users on the platform. And because we don't have the right guardrails in place, now it's a big problem, right? So I think the maturity of a company is something that needs to be considered. And frankly, the sooner that you can actually start following some FinOps methodologies and practices, the better off you're going to be in the long run.
Yeah, Chris, I like to say this: data is a victim of its own success. And what I mean by that is that tomorrow the usage may go up because more and more users find out. So you need to basically future-proof yourself.
Yep. Agreed. It was an interesting article.
Oh, sorry.
I was just, it was an interesting article. I think there are some good points there, but I think there were some dimensions that also need to be considered to fully make the case.
I agree. Yeah. And FinOps is not just about slashing costs. So just to be clear, it's about aligning to the business value. By the way, Chris, did you see that blog post from the Shopify engineering team where they shared how they were able to fix a $1 million query.
I did, interestingly enough. And, for folks who haven't read it, it's Shopify, huge company that sells their services to other shops. You can imagine lots of data that they collect. And they were about to unleash the service where they did the math based on the way that they were structuring their data. This was going to be queries from their customers were going to be in the upwards to $1 million, which is obviously not sustainable for a company. Just to boil it down for folks who haven't read that, it's really just simple, just best practices, right? For folks that deal with large tables in SQL, so their choice, BigQuery, was a technology that they chose, but same story from a Snowflake perspective, same thing from a Databricks SQL perspective. If you're doing that full table scan because you're doing a select star on a table that has been partitioned, well, yes, you're bringing in unnecessary data, and frankly, you're paying for all those compute resources with data that has nothing to do with the query that you're trying to do, right? And so I think that more and more folks are starting to get this. I mean, I can tell you countless stories from customers that we've dealt with where, hey, a $150,000 query was ran the other day with one customer, and you can expect that becomes a big challenge, right, in terms of spiking resources and cloud bills. I think that folks or shops, big engineering shops like a Shopify, there's just a sheer amount of users that they need to support, trying to capture or catch all of these things, such as like select star or hey, use a partition key when a table is partitioned. I mean, how do you catch all that? That's a lot, right? I'm not. We don't have any interactions with Shopify, but I can imagine they probably have a pretty talented staff, and yet kind of capturing some of these things. I mean, these are costly endeavors, right? So whenever folks can use technology, and I know AI is top of mind, but if you can use AI to actually do a lot of these checks, right? Make sure that folks are following the best practices. Think of it as like an AI powered center of excellence of looking at all your queries and making sure that you're doing the right thing. Think about the benefits that can apply across organizations that have massive queries every day.
Chris, where I've seen problems arise is when very large companies I've spoken to, they moved to the cloud and they did sort of a lift and shift. They may have changed the technology, underlying technology, but the data transformation, the business logic, all that just went from on-prem into the cloud. So on-prem, if I wrote a query that just did some weird stuff, join million rows here with a million rows there, at the very most, I slowed my system down and somebody had to kill that SQL. But when that query runs in the cloud, it's going to come back with a $150,000 bill. So I've also seen people have moved temporary tables they've never used for years. They've moved their machine learning models that have not been trained on new data, and all that intelligence needs to be gathered to take that rot out, because in the cloud, you're going to pay for everything. You're going to pay for storage, you're going to pay for queries. So if you've got a table with 10 million rows, but that no one even looks at 8 million of those, well, the query is going to scan all that stuff over and over. So if you can bring some intelligence and you can say, you know what, maybe I should redesign my table and only have fresh current data so I can reduce my cost of operations. That's what needs to happen in the cloud. Absolutely.
And I mean, I've seen customers where they've literally justified going back on-prem. Maybe, it remains to be seen if that was the better decision or not, but I think it all comes back down to what you just said. I mean, going from on-prem to cloud, there's benefits that the cloud provides that on-prem doesn't, right? I mean, there's been many times where a lot of folks are doing a Teradata to Snowflake type of migration, right? And they're literally bringing in all the bad practices of, things that they did, to work in a multi-tenant environment, and then they do it in a Snowflake environment. They're not taking advantage of, virtual warehouses. So you can kind of separate this and do more single tenants and actually burst and actually ask for the right resources for the size of the query itself, right? And so we see a lot of folks that think that, hey, we're just going to just lift and shift this and it's just going to be cheaper. But more times than not, just that lift and shift alone is already a significant increase in cost. And now you're kind of tracking and trying to re-architect it and now you have to support, two models now, right? The lift and shift model plus whatever the new re-architect is. And so, yes, we see a lot of customers do that as well.
In fact, that whole, I don't believe in this story about repatriation because cost was too high in the cloud and now we have to move it back to on-prem. Yes, your cost was high in the cloud, but that's because you didn't architect it for cloud.
Yes, absolutely.
So the first rule should be put in some data FinOps, identify what's going on, fix that. And if that doesn't fix it, because for reasons that are based on data privacy law or security, or you want ultra high latency in edge CDN kind of a deployment instead of being in S3 buckets, sure, you should move it to on-prem or to the edge. But cost is a different thing. We need to understand the cost.
Talk about, Sanjeev, if you had to give just 5 tips for our audience in terms of like how to have success with FinOps based on some of the companies you've seen, for example, in February, Nike talking about the success they're having with FinOps, and other organizations who've started to see real results and success. How would you recommend people do this with 5 simple tips to get started?
So, Clinton, thank you for asking that. The 5 tips that I've talked about in the past, the very first one is what I call discovery. You cannot do anything until you track where the cost is being incurred. Now, this gets very interesting because what do you track? In my research and talking to clients, it's a multi-layered problem. It's actually very interesting. You can look at it at 3 different layers. For example, you can track at the SQL query level, which SQL statements are taking the most time. You can also look at it from users' point of view, which users and which departments are the culprits of most cost incurred in the cloud. The third layer is you can look at it at workload level. So for example, you can say, what is it that's costing me so much money? Is it my ETL, my nightly batch jobs? Is it that I'm running these really expensive data quality jobs? Or maybe I'm running some reports, dashboards, or maybe I'm training different models. So you see, you can aggregate the cost even up to the workload level. Why is this important? This tracking bit is because if it turns out that I'm spending too much time doing data quality remediation or fixing in Snowflake, then maybe I should not do it in Snowflake. Maybe I should do it on my object store, cleanse the data using Spark, and then move it to Snowflake and then run my reports and dashboards. So that is tip number 1, is to identify, discover, track, see where the cost is, what resources are not properly aligned. So I'm underutilizing. I've got big instance types, but I'm only using 25, 50% of CPUs, and or I have some other inefficiencies. And then have some sort of visualization of this, because the consumer is not going to look at SQL queries and look at the where clause and look at the outer join, but you need to visualize it. So that's tip number 1, is what I call discovery. The second thing is to understand the cost drivers. What workloads are aligned to my strategic imperatives? And then, so basically the whole idea of step number 2 is to start prioritizing and say, this is a monthly end of the month job, or this is my annual end of the year job. So if that's the case, then yes, sure, I am going to incur costs because end of the year, I'm closing my books. So you have to understand the cost drivers. So the third thing is having some sort of collaboration. So it used to be that the finance team was most interested in FinOps, but who knows the most about the SQL that is being running? It is the data analyst or the business analyst, because they know exactly what the business needs are and what needs to happen. So the data FinOps, it's a team effort. And this is where we need some sort of a team of people who are responsible for the infrastructure costs, the data costs, security costs, networking costs, and having that sort of space is really important. So let me recap. Discovery, understanding your cost drivers, collaboration. Now, what's number 4? Number 4 is to build FinOps early warning system. So some mechanism whereby I know beforehand when my cost is going to go up. How do I do that? Today, we talk about AI for like generative AI and all the use cases, but I can use AI, I can use machine learning, and I can predict where my cost is going to go. For example, if I have allocated certain budget, so I forecasted that in the next 6 months, this is the budget I've allocated. I can now track the usage on hourly, daily, weekly basis, and I can start seeing the trend line. And I know I'm going to run out of my budget, so maybe I can stop this, or I can stop a query in between. So I run a query, I have an estimate how much is going to cost. Instead of using an index that starts doing full table scan, I should be able to have my system kill that query, alert and notify the right people so we can take some corrective action. So that's step number 4, where I am building this FinOps early warning system. The last thing is automation. And automation, basically, I'm putting this automation so I can repeatedly catch these problems. As I catch them, and by the way, this is also important because if I'm incurring these costs, I may have a chargeback model. Some companies do, some companies don't. So, but whether you do or not, you owe it to your department and tell them that, look, we saved you so much money because we automated the process and we caught the problems. And by the way, here are the recommendations. This is what you should do for cost reduction. These are the guardrails that you should put in place. This is the best practice. So these are the 5 tips that I share with my clients.
Awesome. Chris, any thoughts? Our customers.
Yeah, I mean, very, very solid set of 5. I mean, I've actually, as I was writing these down, I mean, I've seen folks that have run successful FinOps practices, and essentially that's what they're doing, right? I mean, first understanding from a discovery standpoint, where do I begin? Is it a user problem? Is it a SQL problem? So being able to understand that is yes, we need to go. We need to know where we're going to have to address first, right? The understanding the cost drivers, yes, absolutely. I think that being able to just understand everything from top down and who's actually submitting what, so that way we can actually start thinking about planning budgets. I mean, this is where folks may be first thinking about, hey, I need to wrangle costs, but then that next level is just understanding, okay, we need to start budgeting out depending on the different business units, projects, whatever, what have you. The encouraged collaboration, though, I think that this is where I see a lot of folks where collaboration is doing well. And this is where you have finance that are talking to engineering heads. There's a vocabulary that is common amongst them, even though they come from different practices, right? And in many cases, we see a lot of crossover where maybe somebody started in finance, but now really needs to understand all these technical jargon to communicate to engineering as well. But I think the big bottom line, though, is that collaboration piece is a lot of times is tricky for a lot of organizations, because frankly, maybe the platform team doesn't want to work nicely with others. I mean, that's always unfortunate. But I mean, if you want to have a great FinOps practice, I mean, we need to have collaboration, sharing data points, sharing insights, views across multiple business units. But the early warning system, yes, I think that's a lot of times folks are not just there just yet, but I think that is best practice for folks, right? Of, hey, if we had better predictability, or more so, if I, made a very expensive commit to, the data platform of choice, I want to make sure that, like, at the end of the year, I'm within, the range of what I was expected, right? Because too little, then, I paid for something I'm not using, but more times than not, I didn't pay enough, and now I'm paying the consequences by needing to add more resources at an elevated cost. But more importantly, I wasn't expecting this spike, and nobody likes being, getting unexpected bills from that standpoint. And then the last but most powerful is, creating those guardrails. I think that it's all of the above, being able to understand where everything's at from an asset standpoint, understanding the cost drivers, but then automating that into the process. I think that's, I would say some folks are starting to do this right now, but I think this is like the once we're actually starting to automate some of these guardrails, whether it's catching some of this stuff within, a CI/CD process, or setting up some alerts that actually do something if something is caught before the bill comes in at the end of the month. I mean, this is where the folks that are doing it well, these are those are the things that they're implementing.
We've had some questions come in. So a number of questions for you, Chris and Sanjeev. So this first one, Chris, let me pose this to you. We do not have revenue data. What would you recommend we do to start measuring unit costs for FinOps?
It's a great question. I think what you first need is following Sanjeev's 5 tips, right? First, that discovery pointer, right? Being able to understand assets, and then also be able to track, hey, how much are we spending from that standpoint? What folks first start off is it may be an infrastructure conversation first. So like, hey, what is this, my impact to my AWS, Azure, GCP cloud bill? But we need to start also thinking about the business benefits as well. Like, what is this pipeline powering? Or is this a new data product, right? Maybe we're launching some new product to our customers, and we want to start actually tracking and measuring, is this actually worth it for the organization, right? That's where we need to start understanding the business side of the house, right? So being able to understand not just what the resources is, but also taking into account the number of folks involved, right? So think about like the data engineers, the data scientists from that standpoint, and then really tying it to like, what are the business goals? Like it's, this particular data product, we expect it to be a revenue generating new product that we're announcing for our customers. And then being able to track that over time. So like over the first 3, 6, 12 months, hey, things are tracking positive. Hey, maybe I want to start investing more resources. Maybe I want to make that LLM model even more powerful from that standpoint. Or adversely, right? Hey, we were expecting that this was going to be this much revenue generating. We're actually at a loss, or maybe we're breaking even. Maybe we might need to shift those time and resources over to a new data product, right? Being able to understand both the technical side of what this is going to cost from an OpEx standpoint, resources, both from a man hours plus actual cloud resources, and then what are my business objectives, and if I'm achieving it, is something that more successful folks that are launching, data products are measuring their success from that standpoint.
Great. Sanjeev, did you have any thoughts on that as well?
Chris covered it really well. It is such a good question. How do you allocate cost if you don't have unit cost? And I was actually wondering, as I was, Chris, you were talking, you run the Unravel platform. Is there a correlation between the cloud cost and the SQL logs? Because that way we can make that connection. So I'm just wondering if there's something that Unravel does.
Absolutely. I mean, we take all that information. Now, SQL logs, those are very technical in nature, but at the end of the day, that's going to consume compute resources, and there's going to be a cost to that. And on Unravel, if for the audience who may not be super familiar with us, we also have an AI engine that will look at that SQL and identify inefficiencies where, like that Shopify example, right? Maybe there's things that we can do with a 20th of the compute resources, but still give you that same outcome. So absolutely, I think also following from your tips, being able to understand those cost drivers, and in this case, like an inefficiency at a SQL level, I think, that absolutely makes an impact on the overall unit economics for folks.
That's great. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, so here's another question that came in, and maybe Sanjeev, you can address this one. Do you need to have a dedicated team for FinOps?
So this is another great question. In fact, this is another sticking point that I've been having some discussions with my ex-colleagues, because there's this notion that why do you need data FinOps? First of all, Lydia says, you don't need it. There are others who have said you don't need a team for it. Why? Because you didn't have it on-prem. So if you didn't have it on premises, then why do you need it in the cloud? But I think that to me is not a good decision to not have a team. My experience is that most large companies do have a team. For example, Nike's got 7 people dedicated to doing FinOps. And they're not even stopping there. They have, I think, publicly announced that they are hiring another 5 to 6 people. So they're going up to 12 people. If you don't have a dedicated team, how in the world are you going to make sense of the cloud bill? Take an example of Accenture. Accenture is one of the biggest users of AWS. And I'm just taking AWS as an example. They use the huge partners with Google Cloud and Microsoft Azure. But on AWS, there are over 1,000 teams that are using AWS on a daily basis. If you look at the size of the bill that AWS sends to Accenture every month, it is millions of lines, millions. That's how big it is. Because every piece has a line item. You multiply that by thousands of teams globally, and you've got this massive thing. So you need some team and some tool processes to parse this data and derive some nuggets, some intelligence, so you can then optimize your cost.
Yeah, I think if I can add one thing, your first example about folks where they come from an on-prem world and they can't see the need to justify having a FinOps practice in the cloud. And the one big difference between an on-prem model and the cloud model is the CapEx versus OpEx, right? In that CapEx world, procurement folks love this, right? It's here's a set budget, right? We're going to spend it on some hardware, but we control that, we limit that. We know exactly, we have control essentially, right? Whereas in the cloud world, it's an OpEx model, right? Where it's uncapped. You can use as much resources as you want. The challenge, though, is the fact that you don't have control over that. The finance can't make the case to the engineering organization to say that hey, you need to, be within, X million dollars or X $1,000, whatever it is, whatever that budget is for, for whatever they're doing in the cloud. You can't do that. You also can't just turn things off. Things are, especially if they're in production, right? I mean, these are mission critical, applications or data products that are actually providing value to the organization. So we can't just turn it off. And so, because of that OpEx model, you absolutely need some sort of control, and that control in the cloud that's working for companies is a FinOps practice.
Thanks for sharing that, Chris. Okay, right, so we've got another question that's come in here. And maybe Sanjeev, you could answer this one. We would like to implement cost allocation to help teams see the resources they are consuming. Are other companies doing this as well?
I actually alluded to this earlier when I was talking about chargeback, and I sometimes I don't see chargebacks happening as frequently as I thought they would. What some of my clients have told me is that our IT infrastructure is centralized, and we manage it as one big bucket of cost that will be incurred. So we are not doing chargebacks. We don't see any point in doing chargebacks. And I was actually surprised because I also spend a lot of my time in this modern data architecture space, which we loosely call data mesh, where we are moving into this decentralized world where each department is responsible for its infrastructure and developing data products. So my thinking was that if we move into this domain-driven, decentralized, then I will see cost allocation go up more. But so far, that's not been the case. It's managed as a centralized IT resource.
Yeah, and I think to add to what you're saying, a lot of times folks are just leveraging just the tooling that they have in the cloud, right? And even some of the FinOps platforms that are out there, whether it's cloud native like AWS CloudWatch, Azure Cost Explorer, or even things such as like Turbonomics, FTO, things of that nature. They are able to provide some granularity, but it's usually at like the service level, right? But you alluded to, tracking things such as like at the SQL query level, the user level, the workload level. A lot of times, especially on the data side, where there could be some shared resources from that perspective, a lot of times they're just prohibitive of getting down to that granular level of detail. When you break it down, yes, I can look at things at a VM cost level and maybe even put like a tag on the VMs or even like the Databricks clusters if it was a Databricks environment, for example, right? But sometimes those resources can be shared. And we really want to get down to that user level. That the more granular that we can get is where we can actually have a proper chargeback, because it's hard to have a conversation on a shared resource, right? Because you're going to have a conversation with somebody, all the team members that are sharing it, versus if you can get down to like that user level, now you can actually have a candid conversation, or at least have the visibility from a chargeback perspective to start showing, hey, these are where the big cost drivers are at. These are where we need to have conversations. So a lot of times, I think a lot of organizations can be prohibitive just based on just using out of the box platforms to get that kind of visibility for chargeback.
So Chris, what you're saying, could this be an issue of maturity of the FinOps or data FinOps practice? Because once we are mature and we have automation in place and we have the right tools in place, then why not, let each department know what their bill is. But if the effort to get that granularity is so high, that then it becomes a question of, is it worth all this effort to let department A and B know how much it costs? Because it's not clear how to allocate cost.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a level of maturity. In fact, I was with a customer today where they are moving from a Hadoop environment into Databricks. and chargeback's very important to them. It's a very large data shop. And one of the challenges that they're challenging us is that like, hey, we need proper chargeback. The problem though is that they're using it's what they call an interactive clusters, where it could be multiple users, using a cluster. In other words, it's very similar to like an on-prem type of architecture. I mean, and literally what they're doing is they're doing a lift and shift, right? Some of the bad practices, or I would say bad practices, but things that you would do in a multi-tenant, finite, resource environment, they're doing exactly that. And the challenge though is like doing that and trying to track even more granular from that perspective, the way that they're submitting their job. It's challenging, right? Because we can't get to that granular level of detail because they're just following just bad, well, we'll just say older practices that don't translate well in the cloud itself. So the ideal situation is that let's take advantage of the cloud. Let's actually break some of these workloads into their own compute instances, right? Because that's one of the beauty of the cloud is, breaking these things up and sizing up, the jobs accordingly based on what they actually need in terms of compute, memory, so on and so forth. And so and once you actually get down to that level of detail, then you can get very granular in terms of like, okay, I know exactly how much this person or this particular user used because, now they're following the right architecture. But yeah, I think that there's always that level of maturity. And in order for us to not only get that chargeback visibility, but also take advantage of things that you can do to actually save from a FinOps perspective. A lot of times, unfortunately, that gets learned the hard way.
Chris, tell me if I'm going into a rabbit hole here, but sure. This is such an important topic to discuss. The thought that just crossed my mind was in the Google Cloud BigQuery environment, I may have committed to a certain number of slots. And it may be that, I committed that I'll use this many slots for my workload. But the beauty of BigQuery is that if I'm not using the slots for my, let's say, nightly batch jobs or ETL, I can use those slots for my reports. As long as it's within that committed band, it doesn't matter. So doesn't that complicate, like in this case, the whole FinOps scenario? Because I'm dynamically allocating my resources because I've already paid for them, or I've already committed that I'll pay for them.
Yeah. So BigQuery is that's a great question. I won't say it's following the on-prem model, but it is shared resources, right? Yeah. And so we see that's a very popular instance, or that's a very popular option for BigQuery customers, because what's the alternative? You can pay by the per bytes, right? And that's kind of going back to the that OpEx world of like, I can go and go to that world, but like I can also get that $1 million query, right? Because there's no guardrails, right? Now, the one thing that the slots introduce is like, you've got a finite set of resources, right? So you can max it out just like you would do like in a Hadoop environment, right? If you were on-prem. So, there are some additional things that you need to consider from that standpoint. But, more of the conversation, also one more point too, is that also helps folks from a predictability standpoint. So there are some FinOps methodologies, practices, best practices are being followed just inherently because, hey, if I know that I'm going to be paying for X number of slots per month, I know I'm not going to be surprised by the bill. But chances are, though, a lot of times folks are making decisions in terms of like how many slots that I need based on some, hey, this is what I think it would be, so we're going to go ahead and try this out. So, there's always that balance, right? If you do too little slots, then you're actually impacting performance across the organization. And if you do too much, well, then you're paying for things that you didn't even actually use. So the BigQuery slot model is, is interesting, but there's still best practices that you can do from a FinOps standpoint, right? Like being able to write an optimal SQL query. Doesn't matter if it was slot pricing or if you're actually paying, on demand. You don't want to just waste resources from that perspective. So, and then having the proper visibility from that standpoint is also important as well.
And this goes back to the previous question about like, do I need a team? Yes, you do need a team because how else would you know what's the best practice? And once so there's a maturity curve and there's a team, because as you get better at it, then this becomes a no-brainer, but you need that education in the beginning.
Absolutely. And that's why you need to have the right practices in place right from the onset.
Love these perspectives. Thank you so much. So last question before we go, an audience participant has asked, and maybe Sanjeev, you could take this one, is how can FinOps help us launch AI products more quickly? So as we get into the world of AI and Gen AI, how does this apply?
Great question. So when it comes to Gen AI, we need to tread carefully, because at the beginning of this, it was amused to hear, Chris, when you said the promise, this is game changing. The opportunity is vast, but so are the risks. And the risks are all over the place. There's not just cost, but intellectual property, hallucination, abuse of AI. So the first thing that people need to do is, the moment you're starting your Gen AI journey, you need to prioritize and understand what is it, where are you going to get the biggest bang for your buck in putting Gen AI, and then you start doing cost value analysis. Let's take an example. You've got a great product, but not customer support. So that's a great place where you can augment or enhance your customer support through an LLM model that can listen to the calls, transcribe it, translate it to different language, summarize it, and provide recommendations, that are personalized. So if now let's say you say, I know I'm falling behind my competition because my customer support is not that great, my documentation is not that great, so I'm going to put generative AI. So now that's step number one. You've aligned your business strategic imperative with a Gen AI use case. So now the question number two is, what do I need to do to put this use case in practice? Do I need to train a new model, or can I take an open source model and train and fine-tune it, not train it, fine-tune it, or prompt engineer it on my data? So there's a cost associated with that, which is luckily much lower than training a new model. We are not at that stage where you can just train a new model willy-nilly whenever you feel like it. It still requires massive number of GPUs, and there's a massive cost. So we're not going there. We're just talking about fine-tuning and prompt engineering. So then you basically have to assess what is that cost, and then do a cost value analysis, and start with a prototype. That's why I'm saying you start with a few customer service reps. I'll give you another very interesting actual example of financial advisors at Morgan Stanley. Only a few of them right now have been given access to a chatbot that helps do financial planning for their customers. Upon success, upon cost effectiveness study, they're going to open this up to 16,000 financial advisors later this summer.
Wow.
That's what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, if I can add one more point on there too, I think that one, doing something with LLM, I think first and foremost, you need a lot of data. You need the expertise. You need to make sure that you have the right quality checks in place. So I made that point earlier. One additional point I wanted to add there too is that a lot of times we see this in. I think that LLM is taking stage, but let's face it here. AI projects have been around for years. And a lot of times folks put considerable amount of capital here, both from a resource perspective, both from a cloud infrastructure perspective, only to find out 50% of the way there, they've already maxed out their budget because they didn't have the correct FinOps methodology principles in place, right? And so one, if we had known that there was these significant cost drivers that were like, that were unexpected, and two, we didn't do anything to optimize it, and three, it's too late now because it's already been spent. Well, now there's an artificial stop, right? Because now we have to go back to the board or whoever who has money, ask them for additional X million, dollars in resources, and now you're fighting an uphill battle because you haven't delivered anything, right? So this is where I think that as you're going through your journey, you just got to know that you're going to be dealing with lots of data, which is going to take lots of compute, and even more so than ever, having the right visibility to be informed, to be able to optimize, and to be able to operationalize this stuff is even more paramount in LLM use cases. So I think you guys get the gist. Make sure that's you guys are following FinOps best practices and having a team in place to be able to make sure that's your LLM initiatives are successful.
Yeah, it's a learning exercise, right? We are all learning at this stage. So you talked about maturity curve earlier.
Yep.
And that you have a beginner, intermediate, and mature. In LLM, everybody is a beginner.
Yep.
So
very good point.
so congratulations, you're in maturity.
Yes. Yep.
Awesome. Well, thanks to both of you, Sanjeev and Chris, for joining us for this episode today. And we encourage all of our attendees who've joined us, thank you for participating, to register for our third episode in this series for FinOps Camp. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.